I want to tell you something today that might change everything for you. You know what I've noticed? Most people live their entire lives waiting for the perfect moment. They wait for Monday. They wait for the new year. They wait for when they feel motivated, when they feel ready, when the stars align just right. And while they're waiting, days turn into weeks. Weeks turn into months. And months turn into years of nothing changing. But here's what I've learned through decades of studying successful people, through watching thousands of lives transform or stay stuck, and through my own journey of understanding how this magnificent universe actually works. The secret isn't motivation. The secret isn't talent. The secret isn't luck or connections or being born into the right family. The secret is something so simple, so available to every single person right now in this moment, that most people completely overlook it. The secret is consistency, just showing up, day after day after day, regardless of how you feel, regardless of whether you see results yet, regardless of what anyone else thinks or says. That's it. That's the whole thing. Force yourself to be consistent, and I promise you, I absolutely promise you, everything else falls into place. Not eventually, not someday, but inevitably, naturally, like a seed that must sprout when given the right conditions. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I've heard about consistency before. Everyone talks about consistency. But hear me out, because what I'm about to share with you isn't just theory or motivational fluff. This is the actual mechanism by which human beings create lasting change. This is how you reprogram your mind, reshape your character, and completely transform your circumstances. And I'm going to show you exactly how it works, why it works, and most importantly, how you can start using this principle today, right now, to build the life you've been dreaming about. Now, let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. When you look at your life right now, when you examine your current circumstances, your relationships, your health, your financial situation, what are you really looking at? Most people would say they're looking at reality. They're looking at facts. They're looking at the hand that life has dealt them. But that's not what you're looking at all. You're looking at a photograph. You're looking at the developed image of thoughts you've been holding in your mind for months, for years, perhaps for your entire life. Your current circumstances are nothing more than the visible manifestation of your invisible thinking patterns. And here's what makes this so profound, so absolutely life-changing. If your outer world is a photograph of your inner world, then changing your outer world doesn't require you to manipulate external circumstances. It doesn't require luck or connections or perfect timing. It requires you to change the negative in the dark room of your mind. Think about that. A photographer doesn't try to change a photograph that's already been developed. If they don't like the image, they go back to the negative. They adjust the exposure, they reframe the shot, they change the fundamental image that's being captured, and when they develop that new negative, they get a completely different photograph. This is exactly what we're talking about. Your habitual thoughts are the negative. Your life circumstances are the photograph. And most people spend their entire lives trying to change the photograph while leaving the negative completely untouched. They want better relationships, but they keep thinking the same thoughts about people and connection. They want financial abundance, but they maintain the same mental patterns around money and worth. They want vibrant health, but they hold on to the same attitudes about their body and vitality. And then they wonder why nothing changes. They wonder why, despite all their effort, despite all their struggle, they keep getting the same results over and over again. It's because they're trying to change the effect while leaving the cause in place. They're trying to rewrite the conclusion while keeping every word of the story the same. But you, right now, in this moment, you have the power to change the negative. You have the power to alter the fundamental thought patterns that are creating your life experience. Think of it this way. If you planted tomato seeds in your garden, you wouldn't stand there every day expecting roses to bloom, would you? That would be absurd. Yet this is precisely what we do with our thoughts. We plant seeds of doubt, criticism, resentment, and fear, then wonder why our lives don't blossom with confidence, joy, and abundance. The law is impartial. It doesn't judge your thoughts as good or bad. It simply responds to them. Plant an apple seed, get an apple tree. Plant a thought of limitation, harvest a life of limitation. This isn't punishment, it's mathematics. It's the precise, unfailing operation of cause and effect in the mental realm. And here's what makes this so liberating. If you've been getting results you don't want, you now know exactly where to look. Not at your circumstances, not at other people, not at your past. You look at the thought garden you've been cultivating, often without even realizing it. I've watched this transformation countless times. A person who's been trapped in cycles of failure and disappointment suddenly understands that their mind has been their prison warden, not their boss, not their bank account, not their difficult childhood, their own habitual thinking. And in that same moment of recognition, they also realize they're holding the keys to their cell. They've had them all along. You see, the negative thought is not your enemy. It's your teacher. It's showing you with absolute precision where you need to redirect your mental energy. Every time you catch yourself thinking, I can't do this, or nothing ever works out for me, or I'm not good enough, you're being handed an opportunity not to feel guilty, not to beat yourself up, but to consciously choose a different seed to plant. This is the practice. Not positive thinking as a shallow affirmation plastered over deep doubt, but the genuine reconstruction of your inner world. One thought at a time, one moment at a time, one quiet decision at a time. I remember a conversation I had years ago with a woman who'd spent 2 decades believing she was fundamentally incapable of managing money. She'd tell herself this story every time a bill arrived, every time she looked at her bank account. I'm just bad with money, she'd say, as if it were written into her DNA. But when we traced it back, we found the origin. She was 7 years old. Her father had exploded at her for losing a $5 bill he'd given her for a school trip. You're careless. You'll never learn responsibility. And in that moment, a seed was planted. A thought became a belief became an identity. For 20 years, she organized her entire financial life around that single moment. She avoided looking at statements. She handed control to others. She proved her father right again and again, not because she lacked capacity, but because she was living from a thought she'd never questioned. The transformation didn't come from a financial course or a budgeting app. It came when she finally saw that thought for what it was. Not truth, just a thought. A scared child's interpretation of an angry moment. Once she saw it clearly, it lost its power. Not all at once, but gradually she began to make different choices, small ones at first. Opening a statement, tracking 1 week of spending, each action watering a different seed. This is what I mean when I say your circumstances grow from your thoughts. It's not mystical. It's brutally practical. Your thought world is a garden, and most of us have been terrible gardeners. We've let weeds run wild while wondering why we're not harvesting roses. We've watered poison ivy and complained about the rash. But here's what gives me hope, what has given me hope through all these years of observing human nature. You can learn to garden differently, starting now, starting with the very next thought that crosses your mind. You don't need permission. You don't need perfect conditions. You don't need to wait until you feel ready. You simply need to begin paying attention, to watch what you're planting, to notice what you're watering, to make the next choice with slightly more awareness than the last. Because here's what most people don't realize. The mind doesn't just accept thoughts passively, it multiplies them, it compounds them. One thought of resentment doesn't just sit there quietly. It calls to other thoughts like it. It seeks out memories that confirm it. It builds a case, gathering evidence, constructing entire narratives around a single seed. You think one bitter thought about your circumstances, and by evening, you've mentally rehearsed a dozen conversations you'll never have. You've cataloged every slight, every injustice, every reason why things shouldn't be this way. The mind becomes a courtroom where you're simultaneously the prosecutor building a case against life itself and the defendant feeling perpetually wronged. And the strangest part, you think you're just being realistic, just seeing things clearly, just protecting yourself from disappointment. But protection and prison often look remarkably similar from the inside. I've watched this in my own life more times than I can count. There was a period when I convinced myself that a certain opportunity had been unfairly denied to me. And maybe it had been. Maybe the circumstances were genuinely unjust. But what started as a legitimate frustration became something else entirely. I watered it daily. Every morning I'd wake up and almost immediately my mind would return to it. The unfairness, the wrongness, the people who didn't see my value. And each time I revisited it, I added new details, new arguments, new evidence. I wasn't just remembering an event anymore. I was cultivating an identity around it. The opportunity I didn't get became the reason I couldn't move forward. The garden of my mind, which could have been growing 1,000 other things, became a monument to that single grievance. And you know what happened to everything else during that time? The actual opportunities that did appear, the people who did see value in what I offered, the doors that were quietly opening while I stared at the one that had closed, I missed them. Not because they weren't there, but because I'd trained my attention to see only one thing. I'd cultivated such a focused crop of resentment that I couldn't recognize abundance in any other form. That's the real cost of unconscious thinking. Not just that it makes you unhappy, though it certainly does that. The real cost is everything you miss while you're lost in it. And here's what's particularly insidious. Unconscious thinking doesn't just distort your present moment. It actively rewrites your past and predetermines your future. Think about it. When you're in the grip of an anxious thought pattern, you don't just feel anxious now. You suddenly remember every past failure, every embarrassment, every time things went wrong. Your mind becomes a prosecutor building a case against you, cherry-picking evidence from your entire history to prove that, yes, you should definitely be worried because look at all these times things went badly before, and the future, forget it. When you're thinking unconsciously, the future is just a screen onto which you project your current emotional state infinitely forward. Feeling lonely now? You'll be alone forever. Struggling financially? You'll never get ahead. Made a mistake? You're fundamentally broken and always will be. This is how. Unconscious thinking becomes a kind of prison that exists across time itself. You're not just trapped in the present moment. You're trapped in a narrative that spans your entire life, past and future, all of it colored by whatever mental pattern happens to be running right now. I used to do this constantly. I'd wake up in a bad mood, and within minutes, I'd have convinced myself that my entire life was a disaster. My career wasn't just challenging, it was hopeless. My relationships weren't just going through a rough patch, they were fundamentally doomed, and I had always been this way, hadn't I? Yes, my mind would helpfully supply, remember that time in 3rd grade when it's exhausting, and it's completely untrue. The reality is that most of your past contains a mixture of experiences, good and bad, success and failure, connection and loneliness. The reality is that your future is largely unwritten, full of possibilities you can't even imagine from your current vantage point. But unconscious thinking doesn't care about reality. It cares about maintaining its own patterns, its own stories, its own version of you and your life. This is why the practice of conscious thinking is so revolutionary. It's not about positive affirmations or pretending problems don't exist. It's about choosing, moment by moment, where to direct your mental energy. It's about recognizing when you're spinning in unconscious loops and gently, without judgment, redirecting your attention to something more productive. I started doing this with my morning routine. I noticed I'd wake up and immediately start worrying about everything on my to-do list. My mind would race through all the potential disasters of the day before I even got out of bed. Sound familiar? Now, when I catch myself doing this, I pause. I acknowledge the anxiety without feeding it, And then I consciously redirect. I think about one thing I'm genuinely looking forward to that day. Sometimes it's as simple as my morning coffee or a conversation I'm excited to have. This isn't toxic positivity. It's strategic attention management, because here's what most people don't realize. Your brain is always going to generate thoughts. That's its job. The question isn't whether you'll have anxious thoughts or worried thoughts or doubtful thoughts. You will. The question is whether you'll recognize them as passing mental events or mistake them for truth. When you think unconsciously, every thought feels like a fact. Every worry feels like a premonition. Every doubt feels like wisdom. But when you think consciously, you develop the ability to observe your thoughts without being controlled by them. You create space between stimulus and response, between thought and reaction. And in that space, everything changes. You start to notice patterns you've been running for years without awareness. The way you always assume the worst in certain situations. The way you interpret neutral events as personal attacks. The way you predict failure based on past experiences that have nothing to do with your current reality. Conscious thinking gives you options. Unconscious thinking only gives you repetition. And here's what most people miss. The unconscious mind isn't your enemy. It's just operating on outdated information. It's like running a business using financial data from 10 years ago. The numbers might be accurate for what times was asterisk, but they're useless for what times is asterisk. Your unconscious learned to protect you when you were 5 years old. It cataloged every rejection, every criticism, every moment when speaking up got you in trouble. And now, at 35, it's still using that same catalog, still warning you about dangers that no longer exist. The irony? The very mechanisms that kept you safe as a child are now keeping you stuck as an adult. So how do you update the system? You start by catching yourself in the act. When you feel that familiar tightening in your chest before a meeting, you pause. You name it. This is anxiety. Not as judgment, but as observation. Then you ask the question that changes everything. Is this feeling based on what's actually happening right now or on what happened before? 9 times out of 10, it's the past bleeding into the present. Let me give you an example. Sarah was terrified of public speaking, not just nervous terrified. The kind of fear that made her physically ill before presentations. When we traced it back, it led to a single moment in 4th grade when she mispronounced a word during a book report and the class laughed. One moment. 28 years of avoidance. Her unconscious mind had decided. Speaking in front of groups equals humiliation. Must avoid at all costs. And for nearly 3 decades, she obeyed that command without question. She turned down promotions. She stayed quiet in meetings. She built her entire career around avoiding the very thing that would have accelerated it. The breakthrough came when she realized she wasn't afraid of public speaking. She was afraid of being 9 years old again. Once she separated the memory from the reality, the fear lost its power. Not overnight. Consciousness doesn't work like that. But gradually, deliberately, she reprogrammed the pattern. This is the work, you see, not affirmations taped to your mirror, not wishful thinking dressed up as philosophy. It's the deliberate, conscious examination of the thoughts you've been thinking unconsciously for years. Your mind has been running programs written in childhood, updated through trauma, reinforced through repetition. Programs that say, I'm not enough. The world is dangerous. Success means I'll be rejected. If I'm visible, I'll be hurt. And here's what most people miss. These aren't just thoughts. They're predictions. Your subconscious mind treats them as instructions for what to create next. Think of a woman who carries the belief men always leave. Watch how she behaves in relationships. She doesn't consciously sabotage. She's not sitting there plotting destruction. But she tests. She withdraws first. She reads abandonment into normal human distance. She creates the very evidence that confirms her belief, then points to it and says, see, I was right. The thought becomes the thing. Or consider the entrepreneur who believes, I have to struggle to deserve success. He'll work himself into exhaustion, yes. But watch what happens when things start flowing easily. Watch how uncomfortable he becomes. Watch how he'll unconsciously create problems, complicate systems, pick fights with partners, anything to restore the familiar friction his identity requires. His outer circumstances are just mirroring his inner conviction. This is why positive thinking alone fails so spectacularly. You can't paste "I am abundant" over a foundation that screams "I don't deserve." The deeper program always wins, always. The transformation happens when you go beneath the surface thoughts to the foundational beliefs generating them. When you ask not just, "What am I thinking?" but "What would I have to believe about myself, about life, about reality, for this thought to make sense?" That's where the real architecture lives. A man constantly anxious about money might discover it's not actually about dollars. It's about a childhood belief that love is conditional on performance, that his worth is measured by what he provides. The money anxiety is just the symptom. The belief is the disease. I'll give you another example. A woman feels perpetual anger toward her partner, constant irritation, resentment, simmering just below the surface. She thinks the problem is his habits. He leaves dishes in the sink. He doesn't plan dates. He forgets important conversations. So she fights about the dishes. She criticizes. She withdraws affection. And nothing changes because she's addressing effects, not causes. The real issue? A belief planted decades earlier. My needs don't matter. I must earn attention through perfection. Her anger isn't about dishes. It's about a lifetime of making herself smaller, of swallowing her voice, of the exhausting performance of being the easy one. The dishes are just where that unexpressed pain lands, a safe target for rage that actually belongs elsewhere. This is what most people miss entirely. They spend years, decades, even managing symptoms, treating the fever while ignoring the infection, and they wonder why nothing fundamentally shifts. The mind doesn't work the way we pretend it does. It's not a logical machine making rational assessments. It's a meaning-making engine, constantly interpreting experience through the lens of existing beliefs. And those beliefs were formed when you were young, impressionable, before you had the capacity for critical thought. A child doesn't analyze, a child concludes. Something happens, a parent's anger, a sibling's cruelty, a moment of abandonment, and the child's mind creates a story to explain it. I'm not enough. I'm too much. I'm only valuable when I perform. Love is dangerous. The world is hostile. These conclusions feel like truth because they formed in moments of emotional intensity. They bypassed reason entirely. And here's what makes this so insidious. These beliefs operate invisibly. You don't walk around thinking, "I believe I'm fundamentally unworthy." Instead, you just feel anxious in meetings. You just sabotage relationships at the first sign of real intimacy. You just stay stuck in situations that hurt you because leaving feels impossible for reasons you can't quite articulate. This is the invisible architecture of your inner world. These beliefs aren't thoughts you have. They're the lens through which you interpret everything that happens to you. When someone compliments you, that lens immediately searches for the hidden agenda, the mistake they must have made, the pity behind their words. When an opportunity comes your way, that lens helps you find all the reasons you're not ready, not qualified, not enough. When someone gets close to you, that lens shows you all the ways you'll eventually disappoint them, so you pull back first. And here's what makes this so insidious. These patterns feel like they're protecting you. Your mind isn't trying to sabotage you, it's trying to keep you safe. If you believe deep down that you're unworthy of love, then avoiding vulnerability isn't self-sabotage in your mind's eyes, it's risk management. If you're convinced you'll fail anyway, then not trying isn't giving up, it's being realistic. Your limiting beliefs have convinced you that staying small is the same as staying safe. But let me ask you something. How's that working out? How safe do you actually feel living in constant fear of exposure, of rejection, of being found out? How protected are you really when you're cutting yourself off from the very experiences that could bring you joy, growth, connection? The truth is, these beliefs aren't keeping you safe. They're keeping you imprisoned, and the cell door isn't even locked. You've just been told for so long that it is, you've stopped checking. So how do we break free? How do we dismantle these invisible walls that have shaped our entire lives? The first step is the hardest. You have to see them. You have to bring these unconscious beliefs into the light of conscious awareness. You have to catch yourself in the act of running that same old program and say, wait, is this actually true? Or is this just a story I've been telling myself for so long I've mistaken it for reality? Because here's what I've learned. Most of the limits we live within aren't real boundaries. They're chalk lines we drew years ago and never thought to step over. I remember working with someone who was convinced she was bad with money. That was her identity. She'd introduce herself at dinner parties with a self-deprecating joke about her financial incompetence, wore it like a badge. But when we actually sat down and traced back where that belief came from, it was one math teacher in 7th grade who made her feel stupid in front of the class. One moment, one throwaway comment from someone who probably doesn't even remember saying it, and she'd been organizing her entire financial reality around that single data point for 23 years. Think about that. 2 decades of financial decisions, career choices, relationship dynamics, all filtered through the lens of a belief that was installed in her mind before she even had her first bank account. The mind doesn't care if a thought is true. It only cares if it's familiar. If you've been thinking, I'm not the kind of person who, for long enough, your brain will find evidence to support that story everywhere you look. It's not trying to sabotage you. It's just trying to be consistent, to maintain the version of reality you've been teaching it is real. But consistency and truth are not the same thing. So when you catch yourself running that old program, that ancient script about who you are and what you're capable of, you have to ask a different question. Not, is this true? But is this still serving me? Because maybe at one point that belief protected you. Maybe I'm not creative, kept you from risking embarrassment. Maybe I'm bad at relationships, gave you permission to not try, to not get hurt. Our limitations often started as protection. But protection can become a prison if we forget we're the ones holding the key. The question is, what does it actually take to change one of these beliefs? Not just understand it intellectually, actually change it in your bones, where it counts. Because here's what I've noticed. We approach self-limiting beliefs like they're problems to solve. We think if we just analyze them enough, journal about them enough, talk about them in therapy enough, they'll disappear like morning fog. But beliefs aren't equations. They're living things. They have roots. Think about it this way. If you've believed you're not good enough for 20 years, you've practiced that belief approximately 7,300 days. You've rehearsed it in 1,000 situations. Job interviews, first dates, family gatherings. Every time you held back, stayed quiet, played small, you were strengthening that neural pathway. That belief has been to the gym more than most people. So when you read one inspiring quote, listen to one motivational podcast, have one good therapy session, and expect everything to change, you're bringing a single match to a forest you've been watering for decades. I'm not saying change is impossible. I'm saying we've fundamentally misunderstood how it works. Real change isn't about replacement, it's about practice. You don't replace the belief I'm not good enough with I am good enough and call it a day. That's like painting over rust. It looks better temporarily, but the corrosion continues underneath. Instead, you start building evidence, small, undeniable evidence. You commit to one thing and follow through, just one. And when that voice says, see, you're not disciplined, you have a fact to counter it. Actually, I did the thing I said I would. You speak up once when you'd normally stay silent. And when the fear says, nobody cares what you think, you have data. Actually, I shared my perspective, and the world didn't end. This is how you change a belief, not by thinking differently, but by doing differently. The Buddhist concept of skillful action captures this beautifully. It's not about positive thinking. It's not about affirmations. It's about choosing actions that move you toward freedom rather than deeper into suffering. And here's the fascinating part. The thought doesn't have to change first. You can think, I'm not good enough, and still submit the application. You can feel the anxiety and still show up to the meeting. You can. Hear the voice saying, you'll fail, and still take the next step. In fact, this is the only way it works, because waiting for the thought to change before you act, that's just another form of avoidance, another way the old pattern keeps you stuck. I learned this the hard way. I spent years trying to fix my thinking, believing that once I finally felt confident, then I'd be ready to act. But confidence doesn't create action. Action creates confidence. Every time you act despite the thought, you're not just gathering evidence against it. You're fundamentally changing your relationship with your own mind. You're proving to yourself that thoughts don't have to be obeyed, that fear can be present without being in charge, that you can feel uncomfortable and still move forward. This is what the Stoics meant by the dichotomy of control. You can't directly control what you think, but you can absolutely control what you do. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Not power over your thoughts, power over your mind, which means power over what you do with those thoughts. The pattern weakens every single time you choose differently. Every time you feel the pull of the old behavior and consciously step in a new direction. It's like a path through a forest. The old pattern is a well-worn trail. The new behavior? It's barely visible at first, overgrown, uncertain. But every time you walk it, it becomes clearer. And every time you don't walk the old path, grass starts to grow over it. Eventually, the new path becomes the default. Not because you erased the old one, it's still there, but because you've built something stronger. So how do you actually build that stronger path? You start with what I call asterisk, asterisk, the morning anchor, asterisk, asterisk. Before your mind has a chance to spiral, before you pick up your phone, before the weight of the world settles on your shoulders, you claim the first 10 minutes of your day. Not for productivity, not for achievement, for recalibration. For some, it's sitting in silence with a cup of coffee, just breathing. For others, it's stepping outside, feeling the air on your face. For me, it became writing 3 things I was grateful for. Not big things, just real things. The quiet of the house, the fact that I slept through the night, the sunlight coming through the window. It sounds almost too simple, doesn't it? But here's what happens. You're training your mind to look for something other times than the problem. You're not denying the struggle, you're just refusing to let it be the only thing you see. Because rumination thrives in the first moment of consciousness. That's when your defenses are down, when the mind reaches for familiar grooves. If the first thing you do is check your phone, read the news, or mentally list everything that's wrong, you've already lost the morning. You've handed the reins to the pattern. The morning anchor doesn't solve your problems, but it shifts the frequency you're operating on. And from that shifted place, you make different decisions. You respond instead of reacting. You notice the choice points that you'd normally blow right past. And here's the part that surprised me most. Asterisk, asterisk. The mind doesn't need permission to change. It needs proof. Asterisk, asterisk. It needs evidence that a different way is possible. Not someday, not in theory times today, asterisk. Right now, every morning you anchor yourself is proof. Every time you catch the spiral and choose differently is proof. Every conversation where you stay present instead of rehearsing old arguments, proof. You're not trying to convince your mind with logic. You're showing it repeatedly that there's another way to be, And slowly, so slowly, you almost don't notice the internal weather starts to shift. The storms still come, but they don't last as long. And when they do come, you're not as afraid of them, because you've been through them before and survived. You've built the capacity to hold discomfort without collapsing into it. That's resilience. Not the absence of pain, but the ability to metabolize it, to let it move through you instead of setting up permanent residence. And this is where most people get stuck. They think resilience is about being tough, about gritting your teeth and pushing through. But that's not resilience, that's suppression. That's just kicking the can down the road until it explodes in your face at 3 in the morning, or comes out sideways in a relationship, or shows up as a mysterious physical symptom your doctor can't quite explain. Real resilience is softer than that. It's more honest. It requires you to actually feel what's happening instead of armoring up against it. I learned this the hard way. There was a period in my life, and maybe you've had one too, where I thought strength meant never showing weakness, never admitting struggle. I'd take hit after hit and just keep going, keep performing, keep maintaining the facade that everything was fine. And on the outside, it looked impressive. People would comment on how well I was handling things, how strong I was, how nothing seemed to faze me. But on the inside, I was buckling, because all that pain I wasn't processing, it was accumulating, building up pressure like water behind a dam. And eventually, the dam cracked. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't have a breakdown in the middle of the grocery store. It was quieter than that, more insidious. I just started numbing out, disconnecting, going through the motions of my life without actually being present for any of it. Food didn't taste like anything. Conversations felt like static. Things that used to bring me joy just didn't anymore. I was so busy being strong that I'd forgotten how to be human. And that's when I realized resilience isn't about not breaking. It's about breaking consciously, about letting yourself crack open when you need to so you can actually heal instead of just covering up the wound. You want to know what real resilience looks like? It looks like sitting with your grief instead of immediately trying to fix it. It looks like admitting when you're struggling instead of pretending you've got it all together. It looks like asking for help when you need it, even when every fiber of your being wants to prove you can do it alone. Because here's the paradox. The more willing you are to be vulnerable, the more resilient you actually become, not despite the softness because of it. Think about a tree in a storm. The ones that snap, they're the rigid ones, the ones that refuse to bend, that try to stand completely firm against every gust. But the trees that survive, they sway. They move with the wind. Their flexibility is precisely what keeps them rooted. That's what vulnerability does for strength. It creates movement room. It allows you to absorb impact instead of shattering under it. I've watched people spend decades building armor around themselves, layer after defensive layer, thinking they were becoming stronger. And then one unexpected blow, a job loss, a relationship ending, a dream that doesn't materialize, and they crack completely because they never learned to bend. They never developed the elasticity that comes from acknowledging fear, from admitting uncertainty, from letting people see them struggle. Real resilience isn't about never falling down. It's about knowing how to fall and knowing you can get back up. And you only learn that by actually falling, by letting yourself be in situations where you don't have all the answers, where you might fail, where people might see you at less than your best. Here's what I want you to understand. Vulnerability doesn't make you weak. Pretending you don't need it does. Because when you refuse vulnerability, you're essentially saying, I can't handle what might happen if people see the real me. And that belief that you're too fragile to survive being seen, that's the actual weakness. Vulnerability is saying, I can handle whatever comes from being honest about who I am. It's the difference between fragility and anti-fragility. Fragile things break under stress. Robust things resist stress. But anti-fragile things, they actually get stronger because of stress. And you can't become anti-fragile without exposure, without putting yourself in positions where you might fail, where you might be rejected, where you might discover you were wrong. Vulnerability is the gateway to that kind of growth. It's how you develop the confidence that comes not from never being knocked down, but from knowing you can survive being knocked down. And maybe most importantly, it's how you discover that being knocked down isn't the end of your story, it's often the beginning of your best chapter. Think about the difference between someone who's been protected from every hardship and someone who's faced difficulties and worked through them. The protected person might look confident on the surface. They've never failed, never been rejected, never been knocked down. But put them in a situation where things don't go according to plan, and that confidence evaporates. It was built on a foundation of avoidance, not strength. The person who's faced difficulties, they carry a different kind of confidence entirely. It's quieter, maybe, less showy, but it's unshakable because it's been tested. They know they can handle the unexpected because they've already handled the unexpected. They know they can recover from failure because they've already recovered from failure. That's the confidence that vulnerability builds. Not the kind that crumbles the first time you face real adversity, but the kind that gets stronger because of adversity. And here's what's beautiful about that. Once you develop that kind of confidence, you start to see vulnerability not as something to avoid, but as something to seek out. Because you realize that every time you allow yourself to be vulnerable, you're giving yourself an opportunity to grow stronger. You start to see those moments differently. That presentation that terrifies you, it's not just a threat, it's a chance to prove to yourself that you can face your fear and come out the other side. That difficult conversation you've been avoiding, it's not just uncomfortable, it's an opportunity to deepen a relationship or set a boundary you've needed to set for years. This is where vulnerability transforms from something that feels like weakness into something that feels like power. Because you're no longer being vulnerable, because you have no choice. You're choosing vulnerability because you know what it gives you in return. You're choosing to be seen because being seen is how you connect. You're choosing to risk failure because failure is how you learn. You're choosing to feel uncomfortable because discomfort is where growth lives. And let me be clear, this doesn't mean it ever becomes easy. Even when you understand the value of vulnerability, it still takes courage every single time. But the difference is that you're no longer fighting against it. You're working with it. You understand that the discomfort is part of the process, not a sign that something's wrong. You begin to see your triggers not as threats, but as teachers. That person who always seems to know exactly what to say to get under your skin, they're showing you where you still have work to do. That situation that makes your stomach tighten with anxiety, it's pointing to a belief that needs examining. And here's what becomes truly liberating. You stop needing life to be perfect, to feel at peace. You stop waiting for that moment when everything finally aligns, when all your problems are solved, when everyone behaves the way you think they should. You realize that moment isn't coming. And more importantly, you don't need it to come, because peace isn't found in perfect circumstances. It's found in the space between stimulus and response. It's in that breath you take before reacting. It's in the awareness that allows you to watch your own mind without being consumed by it. This is where your practice starts to ripple outward into every aspect of your life. Your relationships begin to shift, not because you're trying to change anyone else, but because you're no longer showing up with the same desperate need for validation, the same hair-trigger reactivity, the same unconscious patterns running the show. People notice. They might not understand what's different, but they feel it. There's a groundedness to you now, a presence. When you listen, you're actually listening, not just waiting for your turn to talk or formulating your defense. When conflict arises, you can stay connected to yourself, even while engaging with someone else's upset, and your work, whatever it is, begins to reflect this shift too. There's a clarity that comes when your mind isn't constantly churning with anxiety and resistance. You make better decisions. You see solutions that were always there but were obscured by mental noise. You show up with energy that isn't depleted by internal conflict. This doesn't mean you become some Zen master floating above it all. You still get frustrated. You still have days where everything feels harder. But there's a fundamental difference in how you relate to those experiences. You begin to see them as weather patterns moving through, rather than permanent conditions of your existence. You're no longer times defined, times by your worst moments. That's the shift that changes everything. This change shows up in how you interact with other people. Before, you might have been defensive, always on guard, interpreting neutral comments as criticism. Now, you can hear feedback without your entire sense of self collapsing. Someone disagrees with you, and instead of catastrophizing, they think I'm incompetent. They've always thought that everyone thinks that you can just consider whether they have a point. You stop needing everyone to validate your choices because you've learned to trust your own judgment. You stop performing for approval because you've realized that the approval of people who don't truly know you is worthless, and the disapproval of people who don't share your values is irrelevant. Your relationships transform. The superficial ones fall away naturally, not through dramatic confrontation, but through gentle disengagement. You realize you've been maintaining connections out of obligation or fear rather than genuine care. And when you release those, you create space for relationships that actually nourish you. The people who remain are those who meet you at your real level, not the performance level, not the people-pleasing level, but the authentic level. These relationships have a different quality. There's more honesty, more laughter, more room for both of you to be imperfect. You become someone safe for others to be real around because you've stopped judging yourself so harshly, which means you've stopped judging them so harshly too. People sense this. They open up around you in ways they didn't before. Here's what also happens. You become more discerning. Not everyone deserves access to your time, your energy, your inner world. You start recognizing the difference between someone who's going through a temporary crisis and needs support versus someone who's committed to a victim narrative and wants you to enable it. You learn that boundaries aren't cruel, they're essential. Saying no becomes easier because you understand that every yes to something that doesn't serve you is a no to something that would. And perhaps most surprisingly, you start attracting a different quality of person into your life. When you stop operating from fear and obligation, when you stop trying to prove your worth through service, something shifts in your energy. The people who are drawn to you change. You begin meeting people who don't need you to rescue them, who don't mistake your kindness for weakness, who reciprocate naturally without keeping score. These new relationships feel lighter, easier. There's laughter without the shadow of guilt. There's give and take that doesn't require negotiation. You realize you've been so accustomed to the weight of one-sided relationships that you'd forgotten what balance actually feels like. It's not dramatic or intense, it's simply pleasant. And that pleasantness, that ease, is revolutionary after years of struggle. You also notice how much mental space you reclaim. The constant calculation, have I done enough? Should I do more? What will they think if I don't? That background noise that's been running for so long, you stop noticing it, suddenly quiets. The relief is immense. You have energy for hobbies you'd abandoned, for creative projects that got shelved, for simply sitting with a book without the nagging feeling that someone, somewhere, needs something from you. Your relationship with yourself fundamentally changes. You stop treating yourself as an afterthought, the person who gets whatever's left after everyone else has been served. You start extending to yourself the same compassion you've been giving others. When you're tired, you rest without justification. When you need support, you ask for it without apologizing. You become, in a very real sense, someone you can rely on, which paradoxically makes you less dependent on external validation. And here's something nobody tells you about this transformation. Some people from your old life will be genuinely happy for you. They'll celebrate your growth, respect your boundaries, and adjust naturally to this healthier version of the relationship. But others, and this is the part that catches people off guard, will double down. They'll escalate precisely because your boundaries are working. This is where you discover who was genuinely invested in you versus who was invested in what they could extract from you. And the distinction becomes painfully, clarifyingly obvious. You'll see people who claim to love you suddenly act like you've betrayed them by simply becoming healthy. They'll call your growth selfishness. They'll rewrite history, painting themselves as victims of your newfound stability. The person who used to ignore your needs will suddenly accuse you of being cold. The one who took you for granted will claim you've changed for the worse. And you're standing there thinking, yes, I have changed. I stopped accepting crumbs and calling it a feast. This reaction isn't random. It's actually highly predictable if you understand the underlying dynamic. When you were accommodating, self-sacrificing, and available on demand, you were manageable. You were filling a role in their narrative where they got to be the center, the one with needs, the one whose emotions dictated the temperature of every interaction. Your transformation disrupts that entire system. You're no longer playing the part they assigned you, and some people would rather lose the relationship entirely than accept a version where they don't have unilateral control. The test of a relationship's authenticity is whether it can survive your well-being. Read that again. If someone only values you when you're struggling, diminished, or available for their convenience, that's not love, that's utility. And recognizing this distinction is perhaps one of the most liberating and simultaneously painful aspects of this journey. You'll find yourself having conversations where you clearly express a boundary and watch someone nod, agree, and then proceed as if the conversation never happened. You'll state your needs and be met with sophisticated guilt-tripping disguised as concern. I'm just worried about you. You're not yourself lately. Ever since you started all this self-care stuff, you've become distant. Translation: ever since you stopped being endlessly available to manage my emotions, I've had to face my own behavior, and I don't like it. The projection is breathtaking in its audacity. The person who's been taking, draining, demanding without reciprocation suddenly positions themselves as the concerned one. They're worried about times you asterisk. They've noticed something's different, and they frame it in language that sounds caring but contains an embedded accusation. You've changed, and not for the better. Here's what they're actually saying. I preferred you when you were smaller, when you prioritized my comfort over your own well-being, when you silenced your needs to accommodate mine, when you provided emotional labor without ever sending an invoice. This is when you'll feel that familiar tug, that old conditioning rising up, whispering that maybe they're right. Maybe you have become cold. Maybe setting boundaries does make you selfish. Maybe caring for yourself means you've stopped caring for others. But here's the truth that punctures that entire narrative. Healthy people celebrate when the people they love start thriving. They don't mourn the loss of your depletion. They don't grieve the end of your self-neglect. When someone who genuinely cares about you sees you establishing boundaries, eating better, protecting your energy, choosing yourself, they feel joy, not resentment. The person who's upset about your self-care was never upset about your suffering. They were just comfortable with it. Your pain wasn't bothering them because it was serving them. And now that you've stopped offering yourself as a resource to be consumed, they're experiencing the discomfort of that loss. And rather than looking inward, they're projecting it outward onto you. Notice how they never say, I realize I've been taking advantage of your kindness. They never offer, what can I do differently to support the healthier version of you? They don't ask, how can we restructure this relationship so it works for both of us? Instead, they make your growth about their discomfort. They reframe your healing as your failure. They position your emergence from depletion as evidence that something's gone wrong. They'll tell you things like, you've changed. You're not the person I fell in love with. Or, you've become so cold and distant. Or, I don't even recognize you anymore. And here's what they're actually saying. You used to accommodate my dysfunction, and now you don't. You used to absorb my emotional chaos without complaint, and now you have boundaries. You used to make yourself small so I could feel big, and now you're taking up the space you actually deserve. They're mourning the loss of the dynamic where they could lean entirely on you without reciprocation. They're grieving the version of you that gave endlessly while they took freely. They're lamenting the relationship structure where your needs were negotiable and theirs were absolute. But they'll never frame it that way. They'll frame it as your deficiency, your hardness, your selfishness, your transformation into someone lesser. And if you're not careful, if you haven't done the work to understand what's actually happening, you might believe them. You might think, maybe I have become too rigid. Maybe I am being unfair. Maybe I should go back to how things were. That's the moment they're hoping for. That's the crack in your resolve they're trying to create. Because if they can convince you that your healing is the problem, they can pull you back into the old pattern. They can restore the imbalance that worked so well for them. They can return to the comfort of your depletion. Don't go back. Don't soften your boundaries to ease their discomfort. Don't shrink yourself back down to make them feel better about their unwillingness to grow. Your peace is worth more than their approval. Your growth is worth more than their comfort. And your future self is silently begging you not to betray what you've worked so hard to build. Because here's what they don't tell you about reclaiming yourself. You become a mirror. And mirrors make people uncomfortable when they're not ready to see their own reflection. When you stop complaining, they see their own negativity. When you stop gossiping, they see their own judgment. When you set boundaries, they see their own lack of them. When you choose growth, they see their own stagnation. You're not doing anything to them. You're simply being yourself. But your evolution becomes evidence of what they could be doing but aren't. And that creates cognitive dissonance they'd rather resolve by changing you than by changing themselves. This is why crabs pull each other back into the bucket. Not because they're evil, because your escape route illuminates their cage. Your freedom whispers about their chains. Your courage exposes their fear. And you'll want to dim your light. You'll want to make yourself smaller again. You'll want to hide your wins, downplay your growth, apologize for your peace. Don't. The world doesn't need another person playing small to make others feel big. It doesn't need another dreamer who gave up because their circle couldn't dream with them. It doesn't need another voice silenced by people who were too afraid to use their own. You staying small doesn't help them grow. You dimming your light doesn't make them brighter. You abandoning your path doesn't put them on theirs. All it does is add one more person to the pile of unfulfilled potential. One more soul who knew better but chose comfort over conviction. One more life lived in the shadows of what could have been. And here's the final truth that brings it all together. The world doesn't reward good intentions. It rewards executed decisions. You can have the most beautiful vision in your mind, a crystal clear picture of the person you want to become, the life you want to build, the legacy you want to leave. But if it never moves from your imagination into your actions, it's nothing more than a pleasant daydream, a fairy tale you tell yourself to feel better about the choices you're not making. I've watched brilliant people fail while less talented people succeed, and the difference is never about capability. It's about execution. It's about the willingness to take the vision and break it into steps, to take those steps and turn them into daily habits, to take those habits and forge them into an unbreakable routine. The person who gets up at 5 every morning and writes, even when the words are terrible, even when inspiration is nowhere to be found, will finish more books than the person with natural talent who waits for the perfect moment. The entrepreneur who launches an imperfect product and improves it based on real feedback will build a more successful business than the perfectionist who spends years planning the ideal launch. The person who shows up to the gym consistently, even when they don't feel like it, will transform their body, while the person with the perfect workout plan never makes it past week 3. This is the gap between potential and reality, between who you could be and who you actually are. And that gap is filled with one thing only: action. Not perfect action, not flawless execution, not genius-level strategy. Just consistent, persistent, relentless action in the direction of what you claim you want. Because here's what I know about human nature. We will always find evidence to support the identity we've chosen. If you've decided you're the kind of person who follows through, who keeps promises to yourself, who does what needs to be done regardless of how you feel, you'll find countless examples in your life that prove it. And those examples will reinforce that identity, making it stronger, more real, more unshakable. But if you've decided you're the kind of person who starts strong but fades, who makes excuses, who lets circumstances dictate choices, you'll find just as much evidence for that identity too. The truth is, both versions of you exist as possibilities. The evidence for either identity is sitting there in your past, waiting to be selected, waiting to be given meaning. What determines which one becomes real is the story you choose to tell about yourself, the interpretation you place on your actions and experiences. And here's where it gets fascinating when you change your identity. When you consciously decide to see yourself differently, your brain doesn't argue. It doesn't say, wait, that's not who you've been. It simply starts looking for evidence to support this new story. It begins filtering your memories and experiences through this new lens, and suddenly patterns you never noticed before become obvious. That time you pushed through when things got hard, it wasn't luck or a fluke, it was who you are. That moment when you chose discipline over comfort, that wasn't unusual, it was characteristic of you. That decision to show up when no one was watching, that's the most authentic version of yourself. Your identity isn't found in your peak moments or your lowest failures. It's found in the meaning you assign to the whole collection of moments that make up your life. And that meaning, that interpretation, is always a choice you're making right now. So when you're standing in that moment of decision, when you're tired and it would be easier to quit, when the voice in your head says you don't feel like it, you're not actually deciding whether to do the task. You're deciding who you are. You're casting a vote for your identity. You're selecting which story about yourself you want to be true. And the beautiful thing about identity is that it's self-fulfilling. The person who sees themselves as disciplined acts in disciplined ways, which creates results that confirm they're disciplined, which strengthens that identity, which makes disciplined action feel more natural. It's a loop that builds momentum with every repetition. But it requires you to be honest about the vote you're casting. It requires you to see clearly that every action is either evidence for who you want to become or evidence against it. There's no neutral. There's no this one doesn't count. Every choice is testimony in the trial you're conducting about your own character. And here's what most people miss. The trial never ends. You don't get to a point where the verdict is final and you can stop presenting evidence. Character isn't a destination you arrive at and then relax. It's a living thing that either grows stronger or withers with every single day. Think of it like physical fitness. You can't work out intensely for 3 months, get in great shape, and then say, great, I'm fit now forever. The moment you stop training, entropy begins its work. Your muscles don't stay built because you built them once. They stay built because you continue to maintain them. Your character operates the same way. Every act of discipline strengthens it. Every act of compromise weakens it. There is no plateau where you're safe from deterioration. This is why you see people who were once strong become weak. Why someone who demonstrated courage for years suddenly becomes cowardly. Why a person known for integrity makes a shocking compromise. They thought they had arrived. They thought their character was established and could now run on autopilot. But character on autopilot is character in decay. The good news is that the reverse is equally true. You can begin building at any moment. Your past doesn't bind you. You're not sentenced to be forever what you've been. The next choice you make is new evidence. The next action is a fresh testimony. You don't have to announce it. You don't have to declare that you're becoming someone new. You simply start living as though you already are that person, and over time, the accumulation of evidence makes it undeniable. This is the quiet power of daily discipline. It's not dramatic. It's not impressive to witness on any single day, but compounded over weeks, months, years, and it becomes the most powerful force in human transformation. You become what you repeatedly do, not what you occasionally do, not what you intend to do, not what you wish you did, what you repeatedly, consistently, actually do. That's the testimony that matters. That's the evidence that builds an unshakable character.